Blood poured in torrents, entrails torn from bodies while the condemned men's hearts still beat. This was the gruesome end for Philippe and Gauthier Dona, two knights who committed the ultimate high treason, secretly sharing a bed with the daughters-in-law of King Philip IV. They arrogantly believed the shadows of the Tour de Nesle would forever conceal their tainting of the royal bloodline. In April 1314, these knights plummeted from royal beds to a living hell, enduring barbaric live castration and flaying before the executioner's axe finally granted them mercy. But how did an empire of lust, so perfectly concealed, crumble to dust, bringing about the bloodiest sentence in European history, all because of a single embroidered purse? King Philip IV, historically known as the Iron King, governed France with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Many historians note he centralized absolute power through ruthless measures, notably dismantling the Knights Templar and challenging papal authority. His Parisian court reflected this unyielding nature, functioning more like a strict, joyless monastery. Within these walls, extreme piety and unquestioning obedience were demanded, creating an environment entirely devoid of warmth or forgiveness. Into this suffocating atmosphere arrived Marguerite, Joan, and Blanche of Burgundy, wed to Philip's sons to secure political alliances. The princesses suffered profound culture shock, trading their vibrant, romantic homeland for the dark, defensive stone of the Louvre. With their royal husbands chronically absent on military campaigns, the young women faced severe emotional neglect and deep isolation. This aching void, heavily monitored yet devoid of affection, ultimately created the fatal opportunity for the Dona brothers. Philippe and Gauthier Dona hailed from the lesser Normand nobility. They were the sons of Gauthier V Dona, the lord of Moussy-le-Neuf. They did not possess massive, sprawling territorial estates. They did not inherit great political power or ancient, highly ranked titles. However, they did possess specific, highly valuable assets for court life. They possessed necessary knightly skills. They had impeccable, refined courtly manners. And, much like the king himself, they possessed strikingly handsome physical appearances. These attributes were enough to secure them respectable working positions within the extensive royal household. Gauthier was appointed as an equerry, a senior trusted attendant to Prince Philip. His older brother Philippe served under the king's own powerful brother Charles, the Count of Valois. These specific positions were the crucial catalyst for the disaster that followed. Their jobs granted them a highly specific and highly dangerous privilege: physical, unquestioned access. As trusted members of the inner royal circle, they were considered men of the house. They were familiar faces. They could move freely through the dark corridors and the antechambers of the private royal apartments without arousing the immediate suspicion of the heavily armed palace guards. It is also vital to understand the human reality behind the chivalric myth they projected to the court. Philippe Dona was not a free, romantic bachelor looking for innocent love. He was a married man. He had a wife, Agnès de Montmorency, and he had legitimate children of his own. His subsequent actions were not just recklessly treasonous toward the French crown. They were deeply destructive, selfish acts that would ultimately obliterate his own family line. What likely began as the innocent playing of a cultural game soon corrupted into a severe, unprecedented political crime. Courtly love was a highly stylized, incredibly popular game among the European nobility at the time. A knight would pledge pure, chaste, and entirely non-physical service to a noble lady. He would dedicate his tournament victories to her honor. He would write her poetry. It was supposed to be a safe, highly regulated outlet for romantic tension. But the extreme, desperate isolation of the princesses changed the rules of the game. Combined with the sheer arrogance and the incredibly close physical proximity of the handsome knights, this traditional game was pushed across a highly dangerous, ultimately fatal line. The rigid boundaries of courtly love were actively fracturing. The extreme isolation of the princesses combined with the dangerous proximity of the handsome knights created a volatile mix. But to escalate from whispered poetry to capital treason, they needed a physical sanctuary. They needed a fortress where the Iron King's terrifying rules simply did not exist. The transition from innocent courtly poetry to capital treason is rarely a sudden, impulsive leap. It is a slow, methodical crossing of boundaries. For Philippe and Gauthier Dona, the initial thrill of the game rapidly mutated into a lethal reality. The rigid, unforgiving atmosphere of King Philip IV's court had created a desperate need for human connection. The three Burgundian princesses were emotionally starved. The two handsome equerries were readily available. The traditional, highly supervised game of courtly love broke down completely. It was replaced by a physical, deeply clandestine, and profoundly illegal reality. Philippe Dona, the older brother and a married man, began a highly dangerous sexual relationship with Marguerite of Burgundy. The gravity of this specific pairing cannot be overstated. Marguerite was not merely a princess. She was the wife of Prince Louis. She was the woman destined to be the queen consort of France. Simultaneously, Gauthier Dona began a mirrored illicit affair with Blanche of Burgundy, the wife of the king's youngest son. The third princess, Joan of Burgundy, navigated a slightly different, though equally dangerous, path. Historical records and the subsequent brutal trial transcripts strongly suggest that Joan did not take a lover of her own. She remained physically faithful to Prince Philip. However, she was far from innocent in the eyes of the state. Joan became the primary architect of the conspiracy. Many historians argue that Joan actively, willingly enabled her sisters. She was the mastermind of the logistics. She provided the necessary ironclad alibis to the king's ministers. She managed the complex, highly sensitive movements of the men. She helped create the physical safe spaces her sisters desperately needed to deceive the court. Why would Joan risk her own life and royal status to facilitate her sister's adultery? Some scholars suggest it was an act of profound sisterly solidarity in a hostile foreign environment. Others propose it was driven by the pure, intoxicating thrill of successfully outsmarting the Iron King's terrifying intelligence network. For roughly 3 years, between 1311 and 1314, this highly organized brazen network of deception operated directly under the nose of the most paranoid monarch in Europe. But a conspiracy of this magnitude required a physical sanctuary. A crowded, heavily monitored royal palace was impossible to use for long. They needed a fortress of their own. They found it in a structure known as the Tour de Nesle. Picture the geography of medieval Paris to grasp the audacity of their crime. The Louvre Palace, where the king and his court frequently resided, sat on the right bank of the River Seine. In the early 14th century, it was not a sprawling museum of glass and light. It was a grim, heavily fortified medieval castle surrounded by a deep moat. Directly across the dark, rushing waters of the Seine, standing independently on the left bank, was the Tour de Nesle. It was a sturdy, imposing stone watchtower. Originally built as part of the city's ancient defensive walls, It was designed to protect Paris from riverborne invasions. It was an intimidating circular structure, rising high above the water, equipped with narrow arrow slits and heavy oak doors. Because of their supreme royal status, the princesses possessed unquestioned, inherent authority over the royal properties in the capital. They utilized this authority to commit a master stroke of deception. They simply commandeered the Tour de Nesle for their own personal leisure. They had the legal right to dismiss the usual loyal city guards from the tower. They essentially ordered the king's eyes and ears to leave the building. By doing so, they effectively turned a defensive military watchtower into a private, impenetrable sanctuary for treason. They created a massive architectural blind spot right in the center of the capital. They completely, brilliantly bypassed the Iron King's notorious and otherwise highly effective surveillance network. Under the cover of darkness, the Dona brothers would slip out of the Louvre. They would cross the river, likely ferried by heavily bribed boatmen, and enter the heavy doors of the tower. Inside, the austere, silent rules of the French court were entirely suspended. However, maintaining a highly dangerous clandestine lifestyle of this magnitude requires capital. Silence is expensive. To sustain the deception, the affair eventually escalated into outright, systemic financial theft. The princesses needed money to continuously bribe the boatmen, the personal servants, and the remaining tower guards who looked the other way. Furthermore, the Dona brothers were not wealthy men. To play the part of royal lovers, they required a lifestyle far beyond the meager salaries of equerries. Surviving financial records and trial testimonies indicate that the princesses began to systematically embezzle from the state. They bled the royal treasury. They quietly took heavy gold coins. They pilfered precious identifiable jewels. They diverted expensive custom-made gifts from the royal vaults and funneled them directly into the hands of their knightly lovers. Fueled by this stolen royal wealth and heavily intoxicated by the secret, explosive knowledge that they were actively sleeping with the future queens of France, the Dona brothers underwent a terrifying psychological shift. They lost their fear. They grew increasingly dangerously arrogant. They began to openly flaunt their newly acquired wealth around the austere Parisian court. They dressed in exquisite silks and heavy velvets that they could not possibly afford on their own. They behaved with the careless, loud bravado of men who genuinely believed they had successfully outsmarted the entire political system. They seemed completely, fatally unaware of the catastrophic legal boundary they were crossing. In the legal framework of the early 14th century, the actions of Philippe and Gauthier Dona were not viewed by the state as a simple private moral failing. This was not a domestic dispute over adultery. To the brilliant, ruthless legal scholars who served King Philip IV, this was high treason. It was lèse-majesté of the absolute highest, most unforgivable order. Grasping the severity of the impending punishment requires understanding medieval political theory. In this mindset, the royal womb was not considered a private biological space belonging to a woman. It was a state asset. It was the most critical piece of national security infrastructure in the entire kingdom. The entire foundation of the French monarchy relied upon a phenomenon known to historians as the Capetian miracle. Since the ascension of Hugh Capet in the year 987, the French crown had experienced an astonishing unbroken streak of luck. For over 300 years, every single French king had successfully produced a legitimate surviving son to inherit the throne. This meant that for 3 centuries, The Kingdom of France had never suffered a catastrophic war of succession. The crown passed smoothly from father to son, father to son. It was the absolute bedrock of French stability and geopolitical dominance. By introducing the seed of a low-ranking minor Norman knight into the most protected royal wombs in the kingdom, the Dona brothers were not just committing adultery. They were committing a profound biological form of counterfeiting. They were literally stealing the throne of France from the inside. They were threatening to place a commoner's bloodline on the sacred ancient throne of Charlemagne, permanently disguised as royal Capetian blood. If a bastard child inherited the crown and the truth was ever discovered, it would instantly plunge the nation into an apocalyptic civil war. This terrifying theoretical and legal threat became a horrifying, tangible reality in the year 1312. Princess Marguerite, the wife of the heir to the throne, gave birth to a daughter. The child was named Joan. The birth of this child sent silent, terrifying ripples through the inner circles of the court. The timeline of Joan's conception aligned perfectly, undeniably, with the absolute height of the secret, late-night meetings in the Tour de Nesle. While Prince Louis initially accepted the child as his own, many modern historians and contemporary political rivals strongly believe that the Dona brothers had successfully planted a biological bomb right in the middle of the French line of succession. The royal bloodline was irrevocably tainted. For 3 years, the dark stone of the Tour de Nesle tightly guarded their secrets. The biological bomb had been planted in the royal nursery, yet the king remained entirely blind. The Dona brothers genuinely believed their charm had permanently outmaneuvered the most sophisticated intelligence network in Europe, operating their clandestine affairs with absolute impunity. But the eventual collapse of this highly organized deception did not come from a palace spy, nor from a sudden crisis of conscience from the princesses. It came from the brothers' own staggering blind hubris. It came from a fatal, irrefutable piece of physical evidence, and it came from the sharp, unforgiving eyes of a visiting queen. The catalyst of their downfall introduces the final devastating player on this historical chessboard. Her name was Isabella of France. Isabella was the only surviving daughter of King Philip IV. She possessed her father's striking physical beauty. More importantly, many historians argue she possessed his exact psychological profile. She was highly intelligent, she was fiercely politically astute, and she possessed a cold, calculating ruthlessness that would eventually earn her the historical moniker, the She-Wolf of France. Isabella had been married to King Edward II of England to secure a vital diplomatic alliance, but despite living across the English Channel, she remained fiercely, aggressively loyal to her native French family. She was deeply committed to protecting the absolute purity of the ancient Capetian bloodline. In the year 1313, a grand diplomatic summit was arranged. Queen Isabella and King Edward II traveled from London to Paris to visit the French royal court. It was a highly publicized, incredibly lavish state visit. The French capital was filled with grand banquets, chivalric tournaments, and massive displays of royal wealth. The two royal households mingled freely. As a gesture of familial affection and deep diplomatic goodwill, Queen Isabella presented her 3 sisters-in-law with magnificent, custom-made gifts. These gifts were highly specific. They were embroidered purses known in the 14th century as aumônières. In medieval society, these small pouches were worn attached to a belt. They were traditionally used to carry coins for distributing alms to the poor. However, the purses Isabella gifted were not standard, generic items of clothing. They were painstaking works of high aristocratic art. They were crafted by hand with heavy gold thread. They were intricately encrusted with precious stones. They were unique, highly personal, and easily identifiable items. They were meant exclusively for the royal princesses of France. The summit concluded successfully. The English royal family returned home, but the diplomatic exchanges were not over. Later that same year, the French royal family traveled across the English Channel to London. They were attending a grand reciprocal celebratory banquet hosted by King Edward II. The royal entourages were massive, filling the great halls of the English palaces. Because they were senior equerries to the French princes, Philippe and Gauthier Dona traveled with the royal party. They attended the grand banquets in London. It was during one of these crowded, highly illuminated festivities that the entire conspiracy began to unravel. Queen Isabella sat at the high table. She looked out across the crowded, noisy banquet hall. She was a woman trained from birth to observe the intricate, subtle politics of the nobility. Her eyes scanned the French entourage. Suddenly, she noticed something deeply alarming. She saw Philippe and Gauthier Dona. They were standing among the courtiers, laughing and drinking. But pinned prominently to the belts of these two minor Norman knights were the exact same highly distinctive aumônière. She recognized the gold thread. She recognized the specific arrangement of the precious stones. They were the exact personalized purses she had personally handed to Marguerite and Blanche of Burgundy just months prior in Paris. To a modern observer, a gifted purse might seem like a trivial detail. In the strict, highly codified world of 14th century chivalry, it was a massive, screaming political siren. For a mere knight to publicly display such an intimate, highly personalized item belonging directly to a married royal princess was an egregious breach of protocol. It went far beyond the acceptable platonic bounds of traditional courtly love. It was hard, undeniable physical evidence of a deeply inappropriate, potentially treasonous physical relationship. The Dona brothers had grown so utterly arrogant, so completely comfortable in their deception, that their basic survival instincts had vanished. They were literally wearing the physical evidence of their own capital treason in plain sight. And they were wearing it directly in front of the combined royal families of England and France. Queen Isabella recognized the catastrophic implications immediately, but she did not react with a sudden emotional outburst. She did not scream treason in the middle of the English banquet hall. Like her father, the Iron King, she operated with mechanical, terrifying patience. She knew that making a public accusation in a foreign court without having the perpetrators locked in a French dungeon would be a catastrophic political error. It would allow the knights to flee, or it would allow the powerful Burgundian faction to mount a coordinated legal defense. Furthermore, many historians argue that Isabella was deeply motivated by her own political survival. The Burgundian faction, led by her three sisters-in-law, was currently dominating the cultural and political atmosphere of the French court. This threatened Isabella's own influence over her father and brothers. Exposing the princesses would entirely break the power of Burgundy in Paris. It would permanently secure her own unchallenged status as the premier woman of the Capetian dynasty. Isabella remained silent. She finished the banquet. She smiled at her guests. She waited. She gathered her thoughts and meticulously planned her next move. She allowed the French royal family and the oblivious Dona brothers to return safely to Paris. In early 1314, Queen Isabella crossed the English Channel once again. She returned to her native France, Upon arriving at the royal court, she bypassed the usual diplomatic protocols. She requested a strictly private, highly confidential audience with her father, behind heavy, closed oak doors, far away from the ears of the Burgundian princesses. Isabella told King Philip IV exactly what she had seen. She detailed the highly specific custom-made purses. She shared her deep, terrifying suspicions regarding the true nature of the knight's relationship with the future queens of France. King Philip IV listened to his daughter. When a medieval monarch was informed that his daughters-in-law were actively committing high treason and polluting the royal bloodline, the standard reaction was immediate: explosive violence. Heads were expected to roll before sunset. But King Philip IV was not a standard medieval monarch. He did not explode in a fit of sudden, unhinged rage. He did not immediately send his heavily armed guards to smash down the doors of the Tour de Nesle. He operated exactly as he had when he destroyed the Knights Templar. He operated like a cold, calculating machine. The king recognized that striking without absolute, undeniable proof could be disastrous. The princesses were not isolated peasants. They belonged to the incredibly wealthy, militarily powerful House of Burgundy. If he accused them of treason without an airtight legal case, the Duke of Burgundy might declare war. It could fracture the kingdom. He needed confessions. He needed physical proof. He needed to catch them in the absolute act of treason. King Philip IV thanked his daughter. He ordered her to remain completely silent. Then he quietly activated the most terrifying, efficient domestic intelligence network in Europe. He placed the Tour de Nesle under immediate, covert, round-the-clock surveillance. He placed his own sons' households under the quiet, watchful eyes of his most trusted, completely loyal spies. He monitored the financial ledgers. He tracked the movements of the boatmen on the River Seine. The trap was meticulously set. For several agonizing months in the early spring of 1314, the Tour de Nesle sat on the left bank of the Seine, shrouded in its usual darkness. Philippe and Gauthier Dona continued their illicit crossings, completely fatally unaware that the unforgiving eyes of the state were now tracking their every single movement. King Philippe IV watched in absolute terrifying silence. He did not act with haste, but instead systematically compiled a massive, undeniable dossier of treason, gathering his irrefutable proof before letting the devastating weight of the French state crash down without a single warning. His covert spies interrogated the boatmen who ferried the knights across the river. They pressured the tower guards, who had been bribed to look the other way. They documented the missing jewels and the missing coins from the royal treasury. The Iron King needed an airtight legal case. He knew that if he accused the powerful daughters of the Duke of Burgundy without absolute proof, he would invite a catastrophic civil war. By April 1314, the dossier was complete. The king finally moved to strike. The royal court had traveled to the Abbey of Maubuisson. This was a wealthy, highly prestigious Cistercian nunnery located just outside of Paris. It was traditionally a place of peaceful, religious retreat for the royal family. The princesses were present. The princes were present. And fulfilling their duties as senior equerries, the Dona brothers were also present. The atmosphere was quiet and serene. Then, with absolutely no warning, the terrifying machinery of the French state violently engaged. King Philip IV gave the order. The king's heavily armed personal guards bypassed the usual protocols. They stormed the abbey. They completely secured the perimeter, ensuring no one could escape and no frantic warning letters could be dispatched to Burgundy. The guards seized Philippe and Gauthier Dona. The brothers were completely blindsided. The arrogant bravado they had displayed in London vanished instantly. They were stripped of their weapons, physically restrained, and immediately separated. Simultaneously, the king's guards arrested Princess Marguerite and Princess Blanche. Princess Joan was also detained and placed under strict, heavy guard. The entire royal court descended into a state of absolute, paralyzed shock. The unthinkable had actually happened. The Dona brothers were not granted the dignity of a comfortable aristocratic house arrest. They were immediately transported back to Paris. They were thrown into the deepest, darkest, and most freezing subterranean dungeons the state possessed. The true horror of their situation was about to begin. In the medieval justice system, particularly in cases of high treason and lèse-majesté, a confession was the absolute gold standard of legal proof. King Philip IV needed the brothers to confess from their own mouths. He needed them to publicly admit to polluting the royal bloodline. To achieve this, the king handed the two minor knights over to his most experienced, merciless inquisitors. Philippe and Gauthier Dona were young, athletic, and militarily trained, but physical strength is entirely useless against the methodical, highly engineered tools of medieval state torture. Surviving historical accounts confirm that the brothers were subjected to the question, the formal, legal application of severe torture. They were likely subjected to the rack, a mechanism designed to slowly, agonizingly dislocate the major joints of the human body. They may have faced the strappado, where their hands were tied behind their backs and they were violently hoisted into the air, tearing their shoulders from their sockets. Under this unimaginable, unrelenting physical destruction, their arrogant resolve completely shattered. The brothers broke. They confessed to the entire sprawling conspiracy. They confessed to the secret meetings in the Tour de Nesle. They confessed to the timeline covering the 3 years of the affair. Most devastatingly, they explicitly confessed to having physical sexual relations with the future queens of France. With the signed, legally binding confession secured, the Iron King moved to the final, most terrifying phase of his revenge. The execution of Philippe and Gauthier Dona was scheduled for April 19, 1314. But this was not going to be a simple, swift beheading in a quiet courtyard. King Philip IV designed the execution to be a massive, carefully choreographed piece of political theater. He intended to completely, publicly obliterate these two men. He wanted to destroy them physically, socially, and spiritually. He wanted to create a horrifying spectacle so profoundly traumatic that no one in the Kingdom of France would ever dare to look at the royal family with disrespect again. The execution took place in a public square in the town of Pontoise. The king deliberately staged the event before the assembled, terrified nobility of France. He forced his courtiers to watch. It was a mandatory, visceral lesson in absolute obedience. The choreography of their deaths followed a highly specific, deeply symbolic legal script. First, Philippe and Gauthier were brought before the massive crowd. They were publicly, violently stripped of their armor, their knightly belts, and their golden spurs. This was not a mere physical undressing. It was a formal degradation. The state was officially erasing their aristocratic class identity and their honor. They were reduced to the absolute lowest status of common, wretched traitors. Next, they were tied tightly to rough wooden hurdles. Heavy draft horses were hitched to the wood. The brothers were dragged through the dirt, the mud, and the sharp cobblestones of the town square. This agonizing process, known as being drawn, was specifically designed to shatter their human dignity. It physically lowered them beneath the feet of the common mob before they even reached the executioner's scaffold. When they were finally pulled onto the bloody wooden planks of the scaffold, the true, unspeakable violence began. The executioner stepped forward to perform a live castration. This was not a random act of cruelty. It was the brutal, literal application of lex talionis, the ancient legal concept of retaliation. The punishment had to specifically mirror the crime. The executioner severed their genitals. According to many contemporary accounts and subsequent historical analyses, their severed organs were then thrown directly to stray dogs in front of the horrified, silent crowd. This horrifying act carried a profound political and symbolic weight. The state was permanently, violently destroying the specific biological tools of their treason. It was brutally stripping the men of the very masculinity they had so arrogantly used to defile the sacred royal wombs of France. But the king's vengeance demanded more. The brothers, bleeding profusely and in unimaginable agony, were still fully conscious. They were then subjected to flaying. While still fully alive and breathing, their skin was meticulously sliced and peeled from their bodies with sharp, specialized knives. Theologically and legally, this gruesome, agonizing act represented the tearing away of their false, glamorous facades. It physically exposed the raw, bloody, and ugly truth of their crimes to the entire world. The handsome knights who had charmed the courts were reduced to flayed, screaming muscle. This was immediately followed by disembowelment. The executioner cut their chests and stomachs completely open. Their entrails were pulled out from their living bodies. Many historical records from the period suggest an even more horrifying detail. Boiling lead and burning sulfur were then poured directly into their open, empty body cavities. This specific, terrifying step symbolized the state forcefully rooting out the treacherous, greedy, and poisonous secrets hidden deep within their bellies. Finally, the executioner raised a heavy sword or axe. He severed their rebellious heads from the national body. The suffering of Philippe and Gauthier Dona was over, but their punishment was not. King Philip IV ordered their mutilated, entirely unrecognizable remains to be hoisted up by their armpits on a massive public gibbet in Montfaucon. By deliberately denying them a traditional Christian burial in consecrated ground, the medieval state intended to condemn their immortal souls to wander in hell for eternity. Their bodies were left hanging in chains, exposed to the harsh elements, to be slowly eaten by crows and scavenger birds. They became a permanent, rotting physical monument to the Iron King's terrifying absolute justice. The arrogant equerries had been entirely erased from the earth. The French nobility watched the horrific spectacle in absolute paralyzed silence. The message was received. The power of the king was absolute. But the crisis was far from over. The physical men had been destroyed, but the women who had invited them into the Tour de Nesle were still locked in the dungeons. The king now had to decide the fate of his own daughters-in-law, and the political fallout of his decision would ultimately tear the kingdom apart. The mutilated bodies of Philippe and Gauthier Dona hung in chains from the massive stone gibbet at Montfaucon. They swung in the cold spring winds, a gruesome, rotting warning to the entire nation of France. The physical perpetrators of the treason had been entirely, violently eradicated. But for King Philip IV, the Iron King, the crisis was far from over. The two minor Norman knights were dead, but the women who had invited them into the Tour de Nesle were still alive. They were locked deep within the royal dungeons. King Philip IV now faced an unprecedented, agonizing dynastic nightmare. He had to decide the ultimate fate of his own daughters-in-law. These were not common women. They were royal princesses of the powerful house of Burgundy. They were the wives of his 3 sons. And their punishment had to be handled with extreme calculated political delicacy. The king could not subject them to the exact same public bloody butchery as their lovers. In the rigid hierarchy of 14th century Europe, royal blood was considered sacred, anointed by God. To publicly flay and disembowel the future queens of France in a town square would desecrate the very institution of the monarchy. It would permanently stain the Capetian dynasty and invite massive immediate military retaliation from the Duke of Burgundy. However, the Iron King could not allow them to go unpunished. Their treason had humiliated the crown and threatened the succession. The punishment had to be severe, permanent, and psychologically devastating. The princesses were formally brought before a closed, highly secretive session of the king's council. They were officially found guilty of adultery and high treason against the realm. Parliament legally stripped them of their royal privileges, their vast lands, and their aristocratic titles. Then the state executed a profound, highly symbolic act of psychological violence. Before the assembled silent court, the executioners stepped forward with heavy iron shears. They forcibly grabbed Marguerite and Blanche of Burgundy. They completely shaved the young women's heads. To a modern audience, a forced haircut might seem like a minor indignity compared to the rack. But in the highly codified, intensely visual world of medieval Europe, a noble woman's long hair was her ultimate crown. It was the physical manifestation of her femininity, her aristocratic status, and her honor. By aggressively shaving their heads down to the bare scalp, the French state was physically stripping them of their royalty. They were publicly reducing the highest women in the land to the visual status of common convicted prostitutes or disgraced penitents. It was an act of complete devastating social erasure. With their heads shaved and their royal clothing replaced by coarse, rough sackcloth, Marguerite and Blanche were banished from Paris. They were loaded into heavily guarded, unmarked wagons. They were transported far away from the glittering, luxurious courts they had once commanded. Their destination was Chateau Gaillard. Chateau Gaillard was a massive, terrifying military fortress located in Normandy, perched high above the River Seine. Originally built by the English king Richard the Lionheart a century earlier, it was considered one of the most impregnable, intimidating structures in Europe. It was not a palace. It was a machine of war. Upon arrival, the 2 young women were dragged deep into the freezing subterranean dungeons of the fortress. They were locked in separate, lightless cells. The contrast was absolute. They had gone from sleeping on soft feather beds draped in imported silks, eating heavily spiced meats and drinking fine wines, to sitting on damp, rotting straw in pitch blackness. The thick stone walls dripped with freezing moisture. They were fed only the absolute bare minimum of coarse bread and water to keep their hearts beating. The state intended for them to slowly, quietly rot away from the memory of the French people. For Marguerite of Burgundy, the wife of the heir to the throne, the nightmare in the dark was relatively short, but entirely brutal. In November 1314, just months after the Tour de Nesle scandal broke, King Philip IV suffered a massive stroke during a hunting trip. The Iron King was dead. His eldest son, Prince Louis the Quarreler, officially ascended to the throne as King Louis X of France. But Louis X inherited a massive constitutional crisis. He was now the king, but his legal wife, Marguerite, was a convicted, shaved traitor rotting in a dungeon. King Louis X desperately needed a legitimate male heir to secure his new reign. To get an heir, he needed a new wife. He quickly arranged a diplomatic marriage with a young, beautiful princess named Clémence of Hungary. But there was a massive legal roadblock. King Louis could not marry Clémence while Marguerite was still breathing. He desperately needed the Pope to grant him a formal annulment. However, the papacy was in a state of unprecedented chaos. Pope Clement V had died shortly before King Philip IV. The College of Cardinals was hopelessly deadlocked. The papal conclave dragged on for months, then years. There was literally no pope sitting on the throne of St. Peter to sign the annulment papers. King Louis X was trapped in a loveless, treasonous marriage with no legal way out. Then, in the cold, damp spring of 1315, an incredibly convenient event occurred. Queen Marguerite of Burgundy, still locked in her freezing underground cell at Château Gaillard, was suddenly found dead. The official royal proclamation stated that the 25-year-old queen had simply succumbed to a severe chill or tuberculosis brought on by the harsh conditions of her imprisonment. However, almost no one in the French court believed the official narrative. The timing was entirely too perfect. Many contemporary chroniclers and a vast majority of modern historians strongly suspect that King Louis X ordered her assassination. It is widely believed that royal guards were quietly dispatched to the dungeon. In the pitch blackness of her cell, the young queen was brutally smothered with a heavy pillow or strangled with a cord. Her death neatly, permanently solved the king's legal problem. Just a few days after Marguerite's quiet burial in a local churchyard, King Louis X married Clémence of Hungary. The fate of Princess Blanche of Burgundy was less violent, but arguably much more psychologically torturous. Blanche was married to the king's youngest son, Prince Charles. Because Charles was not the immediate heir to the throne, there was less urgent, bloody political pressure to eliminate her. Therefore, Blanche was left alive in the freezing darkness of Château Gaillard. She lingered in the horrific subterranean conditions for over a decade. The sheer sensory deprivation, the constant cold, and the terrible diet completely broke her physical and mental health. Years later, when her husband eventually ascended to the throne, as King Charles IV, he successfully petitioned the newly elected pope for a formal annulment. The marriage was dissolved on the incredibly convenient, highly technical grounds of spiritual consanguinity. With her marriage annulled, the heavily aged, completely broken Blanche was finally pulled out of the dungeon. She was transferred to the nunnery of Maubuisson, ironically the exact same abbey where she had been suddenly arrested years earlier. She lived her final days in complete silent obscurity, dying as a forgotten nun in 1326. But there was one major exception to the tragedy of the Tour de Nesle. The third princess, Joan of Burgundy, experienced a remarkably different fate. Joan had not taken a lover. She was accused of being the mastermind, the facilitator, and the silent accomplice who hid her sister's treason. After the arrests at Maubuisson, she was detained, but she was not sent to the brutal dungeons of Château Gaillard. She was placed under a much more comfortable, dignified house arrest at the Château de Dourdan. Crucially, her survival was secured entirely by the political calculations of her husband, Prince Philip the Tall. Prince Philip was a highly intelligent, intensely pragmatic man. He looked at the catastrophic scandal and made a cold strategic decision. He refused to abandon his wife. He did not stand by her out of blind romantic love. He stood by her because Joan was the sole legitimate heiress to the incredibly wealthy, strategically vital county of Artois and the free county of Burgundy, Franche-Comté. If Prince Philip allowed his wife to be permanently convicted of treason and stripped of her titles, those massive territories would revert to the crown or be contested in a bloody civil war. Philip wanted that land. To keep the land, he had to keep the wife. While Marguerite and Blanche were shivering in the dark, Prince Philip actively worked behind the scenes to clear Joan's name. He wrote her comforting letters. He applied massive political pressure to the Parliament of Paris. He utilized the immense lobbying power of her powerful Burgundian relatives. By the end of 1314, Parliament officially cleared Joan of all charges of treason. She was legally declared innocent of complicity. Prince Philip rode to Dourdan, personally collected his wife, and brought her back to the royal court with full honors. Remarkably, the woman who had allegedly orchestrated the logistics of the Tour de Nesle survived the Iron King's wrath. Years later, when her husband ascended to the throne, Joan of Burgundy was formally crowned as the Queen Consort of France. The immediate treason was formally purged. The physical perpetrators had been violently erased from the earth. The Dona brothers were rotting on the gibbet. Marguerite had been quietly smothered in the dark. Blanche was locked away in a freezing dungeon, and Joan was restored to power through cold political calculation. The Iron King believed his swift, terrifying justice had saved the Capetian dynasty. He was fundamentally wrong. He had failed to realize one crucial, devastating truth. The biological bomb, planted by Philippe Dona, had not been defused. The true catastrophic geopolitical cost of the Tour de Nesle affair was only just beginning to unfold, and the seed of destruction had already been sown in the royal nursery. The geopolitical apocalypse began quietly in the summer of 1316. King Louis X, the eldest son of the Iron King, suddenly fell severely ill after a strenuous game of real tennis. He drank a large quantity of chilled wine, collapsed with a violent fever, and died shortly after. He was only 26 years old. His sudden death plunged the French court into absolute unmitigated panic. King Louis X left behind his new second wife, Clemence of Hungary. She was heavily pregnant, but the king also left behind a living child from his first disastrous marriage. That child was Princess Joan. She was a 4-year-old girl. She was the daughter of the executed Queen Marguerite. For the first time in over 3 centuries, there was no adult male heir ready to take the crown of France. The throne sat empty. The entire nation held its breath, waiting to see if Queen Clemence would deliver a boy or a girl. Prince Philip, the king's highly intelligent, incredibly ambitious younger brother, immediately stepped into the power vacuum. He declared himself the regent of France. He effectively took control of the government, the treasury, and the military while they waited for the royal birth. In November 1316, Queen Clemence went into labor. She delivered a male child. He was immediately proclaimed King John I of France. He is known to history as John the Posthumous. For a brief, fleeting moment, the Capetian miracle seemed to hold. The direct male line had survived by the narrowest possible margin. But King John I lived for exactly 5 days. The infant king died suddenly in his crib. It remains the shortest, most tragic reign in the entire history of the French monarchy. His death instantly sparked massive, uncontrollable rumors of assassination. Many contemporary chroniclers and numerous modern historians strongly suspect foul play. They suggest that Prince Philip, desperate for the crown, ordered the infant to be poisoned. Some historical accounts even propose a dramatic covert switch, claiming the real king was smuggled out of the palace and replaced with a dying peasant child. Whatever the true medical cause of the infant's death, The political reality was absolute. The male line of King Louis X was completely extinct. The succession crisis had officially arrived. The crown should have legally passed to the next in line. By the standard laws of inheritance that governed every single aristocratic family in France, the crown belonged to the 4-year-old Princess Joan. But the French nobility looked at the little girl, and they were utterly terrified. They did not just see a vulnerable female child. They saw the dark, rotting shadow of the Tour de Nesle. They looked at Joan, and they saw the ghost of Philippe Dona. Because the timeline of Joan's conception perfectly aligned with her mother's treasonous affair, a massive, unspoken consensus settled over the royal court. The highest lords of the realm fundamentally deeply believed that Joan was a bastard. They believed she was the biological daughter of a minor Norman equerry, not the daughter of the king. If they crowned Joan as the queen regnant, they risked placing a commoner's bloodline on the sacred throne of Charlemagne. They risked handing the ultimate power of France to a child conceived in treason. The nobility flatly, absolutely refused to let her inherit. Prince Philip saw his golden opportunity. He immediately locked the heavy gates of Paris. He mobilized the royal guards. He gathered his most powerful political allies, including his heavily influential Burgundian in-laws. He bypassed the young princess entirely. In early 1317, Prince Philip rushed to the Cathedral of Reims. He was hastily anointed and crowned as King Philip V of France. It was a highly successful, completely bloodless coup d'etat. He had stolen the throne from his niece. But King Philip V was a deeply pragmatic man. He knew that raw military force was not enough to sustain a legitimate reign. He needed a permanent, undeniable legal justification to completely erase Princess Joan's claim to the crown. He tasked the most brilliant, ruthless legal scholars at the University of Paris to solve his political problem. He commanded them to find a legal precedent that would officially, permanently bar women from inheriting the French throne. The royal lawyers dug deep into the ancient, dusty historical archives of the kingdom. They laid the groundwork for what would soon become a full resurrection of an obscure, centuries-old tribal code, the Salic's Law. The Salic Law was an ancient legal code originally written for the Salian Franks during the reign of King Clovis in the 6th century. Crucially, the original text of this law had absolutely nothing to do with royal succession. It was a simple private property law. It primarily dealt with the inheritance of private allodial land, stating that women could not inherit specific types of ancestral family estates. The lawyers of Philip V took this ancient, completely irrelevant property code and deliberately, brilliantly twisted it. They elevated the Salic Law to the status of a fundamental, unbreakable constitutional principle of the French state. They aggressively reinterpreted the text to explicitly declare that the crown of France was so sacred, so uniquely masculine, that it could never, under any circumstances, be inherited by a woman. Furthermore, they established a devastating legal corollary. They declared that a woman could not even transmit the right of inheritance to her male sons. The female line was entirely legally severed from the throne. This desperate, highly manipulated legal maneuver successfully solved King Philip V's immediate problem. It permanently barred Princess Joan from the throne. She was quietly sent away to the Kingdom of Navarre, entirely removed from French politics. King Philip V sat securely on his stolen throne, but in his desperate rush to justify his usurpation, he had inadvertently set a lethal trap for his own dynasty. The catastrophic, entirely unintended consequences of the resurrected Salic law, manifested with terrifying speed. King Philip V ruled effectively for 6 years. He was a highly capable administrator, but he suffered from the exact same dynastic curse as his older brother. His only son died in infancy. When King Philip V died in 1322, he left behind only 4 daughters. Because he had so aggressively, publicly championed the Salic law to steal the throne from his niece, that exact same law was immediately turned against his own children. His daughters were legally barred from inheriting the crown. The throne passed to the third and final brother. The youngest son of the Iron King ascended as King Charles IV. Charles IV was the man who had been married to Princess Blanche, the second woman arrested in the Tour de Nesle affair. He had eventually secured an annulment and remarried twice, desperately hoping to produce a male heir and save his doomed family. But the Capetian line was fundamentally broken. King Charles IV died in 1328. His pregnant wife gave birth to a daughter shortly after his death. With that final biological failure, the nightmare was complete. The mighty 300-year-old direct Capetian dynasty, the absolute bedrock of European political stability, was completely, entirely extinct in the male line. The sons of the Iron King were dead. They had left no sons of their own. The throne of the most powerful kingdom in Western Europe sat completely empty. The French nobility scrambled to find a new king. Following the strict, newly established rules of the Salic law, they had to trace the male bloodline backward and outward. They selected Philip, Count of Valois. He was a cousin to the dead kings. He was entirely French, and his claim passed strictly through the male line. He was crowned King Philip VI, establishing the new Valois dynasty. But across the English Channel, a completely different monarch looked at the vacant throne of France. He looked at the vast, wealthy kingdom, and he formally, aggressively claimed it for himself. His name was King Edward III of England. Edward III was not a distant cousin. He was the direct grandson of the Iron King. He possessed a much closer, much more intimate blood tie to the Capetian dynasty than Philip of Valois. His legal claim was based entirely on the fact that his mother was Isabella of France. Isabella was the she-wolf. She was the exact same woman who had sat in the London banquet hall 14 years earlier. She was the woman who had spotted the embroidered purses on the belts of the Dona brothers. She was the woman who had whispered the secret to her father, setting the entire bloody, catastrophic chain of events into motion. King Edward III argued that, as the closest living male relative to the dead kings, the crown of France rightfully belonged to him. The French nobility were absolutely horrified. The prospect of an English king ruling from Paris was unacceptable. They immediately deployed their ultimate legal weapon. The French lawyers cited the newly established ironclad precedent of the Salic law. They formally legally rejected the English king's claim. They argued that because Isabella of France was a woman, she was legally barred from the succession. Therefore, she could not possibly transmit a right to the throne that she did not legally possess herself. They told the King of England that his blood claim was entirely invalid. King Edward III did not accept their legal arguments. He did not accept the sudden resurrection of an ancient tribal code. He believed his birthright had been stolen. In 1337, King Edward III of England officially declared war on King Philip VI of France. That specific legal rejection, born directly from the panic of the Tour de Nesle scandal, was the absolute, undeniable spark that ignited the 100 Years' War. This was not a brief border dispute. It was a catastrophic, multi-generational military conflict. It plunged England and France into more than a century of unrelenting slaughter. It brought the terrifying longbow to the muddy fields of Agincourt and Crécy. It unleashed roaming bands of brutal mercenaries across the French countryside. It caused extreme, widespread economic devastation. It permanently, violently altered the borders and the national identities of both nations. When we look back at the Tour de Nesle affair, it stands as a masterclass in the terrifying fragility of absolute power. Two minor knights driven by lust, extreme boredom, and a profound, fatal overestimation of their own cleverness sought warmth and validation in a cold, unforgiving court. They thought they were simply playing a dangerous but private romantic game. They believed their charm and their proximity to power made them entirely immune to consequence. In doing so, they inadvertently snapped the bloodline of the most powerful dynasty in Europe. It is a stark historical truth that proves how the most intimate, selfish human failings can easily, rapidly dismantle the grandest empires. It is a story that shows how the delicate secret whispers of lovers, hidden away in a dark stone tower on the River Seine, can ultimately transform into the deafening, bloody roar of a century of war.